inflationary gap is, or what happens during the inflationary gap? Or maybe even how could you characterize this? Like, anybody know? Yeah.
Inflationary gap is when the real GDP is above the GDP that's like if everything's running normally, and it's characterized by higher prices.
Pretty much, right? But I'm more talking about why are the prices rising, right? So in here, why do we call it an inflationary gap, right? Like, what is inflation? It's an increase in the price level, right? That's what inflation means. It means a positive change in the price level. This is called an inflationary gap because what did we say was happening when we're at our long-run equilibrium? How do we characterize it in terms of intensity of use? What intensity of use are we at in our long-run equilibrium? We're at our normal intensity of use. So you can presume that if we're above our long-run equilibrium, we must be at a high intensity of use, right? So it's kind of the same story as before. When we're at this state, right, like people are working overtime and machines are being pushed to their limit, right? So costs are rising. In our model, we basically assume that all this is working through the labor force, right? So basically, we can think of an inflationary gap as meaning there's an excess demand for labor, right? So there's an excess supply, no, in this case, yeah, excess demand for labor, right? Or a shortage of labor. And so what's going to happen is a shortage of labor is going to drive wages up, which drives costs up if we assume that productivity remains constant, right? So that's a key assumption. Remember that this is, so if we assume that labor is not becoming more productive, but wages are growing, right? And that's going to start moving this cost curve to the left, right? When we increase factor prices, that shifts our short-run supply, like we saw in the previous chapters, right? So if this inflationary gap opens up, that creates an excess demand for labor, which is going to cause wages to rise, and it's going to shift our short-run aggregate supply to the left to sort of compensate for this, right? So that's the second adjustment, right? So we move to here off of our long-run equilibrium, and then basically this guy to compensate is going to shift to the left. And so now we're back. Now we're back at our long-run equilibrium, right? Our long-run equilibrium output, but notice now our price level is permanently higher, right? So while that gap was open, price levels are rising, and then when it closes, price levels stop rising, but now they're permanently higher, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So this is like what we call a form of automatic stabilization, right? Because this is what happens absent any intervention from the government in our model, right? If demand increases, then firms are going to need more factors to make more things, and those factor prices are going to go up, which is going to shift the supply curve to the left, right? Basically, when demand goes up, prices are going to go up to compensate because we can only make so much more, right? That's kind of the idea. So that's what happens with that's a positive demand shock we've just illustrated, right? But you can kind of get the story for any of them, right? In all situations, what automatically is going to happen is that it's the short-run supply curve that's going to move around to get us back to the long-run equilibrium, right? Regardless. Even if initially it was a short-run aggregate supply shock that caused it, right? So, let's see here. So yeah, that was an inflationary gap. I mean, you can imagine what happens in a recessionary gap, right? So let me just draw this again. So and then let's assume now that we've got a recession. So don't worry about why it was caused, right? There's a bunch of reasons, right? Maybe there's either a demand or supply shock of some kind that moved us off our long-run equilibrium, right? So now there's a recessionary gap, let's say. So this is our recessionary gap right here, right? So we said that when there's an inflationary gap, there's an excess demand for labor, wages rise, costs rise, the curve shifts to the left, and then we're back on our long-run equilibrium, right? So what's gonna happen here is it's kind of the opposite, right? So here we characterize this by there being an excess of labor, right? So there's more labor available than there is demand for, and so wages are gonna fall, which is gonna shift our short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, right? So maybe something like that, right? So it's the opposite in a recessionary gap, right? There's too much labor, wages fall, costs fall, the curve shifts back to the long-run equilibrium, right? In all cases, if the government, we'll talk about government intervention in a second, but in all cases, we kind of assume that it's the short-run supply curve that's moving around. Whatever happens, that's what adjusts to get us back to the long-run equilibrium for now. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So like obviously I didn't cover all the scenarios, but you can kind of imagine what would happen if there was like a short-run supply shock, right? Maybe it's not something that affects demand, but like oil prices go up, so the short-run supply curve shifts to the right. To the left. And then even in that scenario, it's the short-run supply curve that has to slowly move back to the right, right? And we sort of characterize this stabilization with something called the Phillips curve, right? And this is not really a theoretical, it's like something we observe in data, or it's something that an economist named Phillips observed in data, kind of. But it basically looks like this, right? So this is probably relevant. I don't know if you guys have already seen some of your quiz, but so our Phillips curve is going to look like this, right? So this here is unemployment. And let's say this is not wages, right, but the rate of change of wages, right? So if this is positive, then that means wages are going up, and then if that's negative, that means wages are going down, right? We're not talking about the level of wages, but the direction in which they're going. So our Phillips curve is going to be downward sloping like that, right? It's nothing special. And then it intersects here at our, what we call the natural rate of unemployment, right? And as we've talked about before, that natural rate is different from zero, right? It's positive because of things like frictional unemployment, right? So it's pretty simple, but it does kind of say a lot, right? So you can kind of think of unemployment as the inverse of output, right? When unemployment is high, output must be low, right? And if unemployment is low, then output must be high. Does that make sense? So if you see unemployment here, you can kind of think of it as output in a way. So let's say we're up here, right? Let's say, I don't know, the pandemic happens and a bunch of restaurants close, so now unemployment goes up, right? What's going to happen to wage, or sorry, in this case unemployment will be going down, so we want unemployment going up, it's going to be here, right? In this case, what's going to happen, right? Where are we? If we're right here on our curve, is our change in wages positive or negative?
Negative.
It's negative, right? So when we're in this region, there's going to be pressure on wages to fall, right? There's excess labor, so wages are going to fall, and we're going to return to our natural rate of unemployment, which corresponds to our Y star, right? So if we're above here, so let's say, I don't know, a bunch of people exit the labor force, let's say, right? Maybe a bunch of people retire. That might reduce unemployment, right? Because if the labor force is decreasing in size. So, but I don't know, whatever, any shock that might reduce unemployment, right? That's going to cause pressure on wages to increase, right? We're going to move back to that level of unemployment. Does that make sense? So that's like, this is just like, it's kind of like a bit of a disconnected concept. It's just like something that might come up, right? Like you maybe somebody will ask you, like on an example, what the Phillips curve is. That's what we mean by the Phillips curve. And it's related to the stabilization process, right? It also tells us that the negative slope tells us that there's a negative trade-off between change in wages, which is kind of code, like it's basically inflation, right? Like we kind of assume that the main driver of price changes is going to be changes in wages, because factor prices, it's like like I said, like companies will lock themselves into like futures or forward contracts, right? Like they will buy their factors of supply. They'll agree to buy them at certain prices well ahead of time. So generally wages are what's going to like absorb adjustments in practice. In our model, we kind of assume that though, right? So it tells us that basically if we want to increase unemployment, we have to reduce wages. And if we want to decrease unemployment, then we have to increase wages, which is kind of intuitive, right? That makes sense. If you want more people to work, you need to pay them more, but that's going to cause price levels to go up, right? So anyway, that's the Phillips curve. Kind of a disconnected concept, but I was asked to sort of go over that quickly. So, all right. So,
hey Bill,
yeah.
can you explain why if the supply curve has a shock, why it corrects itself?
Well, we basically assume that, like, let's say oil prices go up, that means wages are gonna have to go down over time, right? Because like firms will, if like they can't afford to make as much, they'll have to reduce output and they'll reduce their use for labor, which is gonna reduce their wage expense, right? Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, all right.
So it's kind of like, remember that like we're kind of assuming wages are moving around, but there's other things in the background that can also shift short run supply. So think of shocks as things besides wages for now, right? So things like the price of copper or the rent increase or something like that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like the wages decrease and that's why it moves back to the right, yeah.
Yeah, so like something other than wages moves it initially and then wages are what's gonna move it back.
Okay.
So we can think of like, I mean, I think it says this in the G book pretty much, but basically the short run aggregate supply is always gonna pull us back to Y star using wage adjustments, right? Regardless of what happens, kind of like I said before. So now let's think about why, like, what the federal government could do in this situation and why they might want to do it, right? So first of all, we assume that if we don't intervene, it's the short run aggregate supply curve that does all the movement, right? But we know that the government can affect the aggregate demand curve, right? How does it do that? What are the two things, what are the two tools of fiscal policy we have, that the government has?
It can lower taxes.
It can lower taxes, so that's one of them. What's another thing it can do? Other than raise taxes?
Subsidize budgets.
It can subsidize, but that's kind of like a reverse tax, right?
So to create demand by creating projects or asking for infrastructure.
Yeah, so I mean, it can spend money, right?
Yeah.
That's government spending. So basically in our model, right, maybe, we'll erase this. Is everybody okay with this here? I'm just gonna erase this one. So basically we're gonna,
Should ask to put it back up.
the government controls G and T, right? That's what we assume, and its budget function is kind of like something like this, right? It's going to be, this is so basically, our budget looks something like this, right? Our budget line. Which is just budget in this case, like it's our budget balance, right? It's just government savings, public savings, however you want to call it, right? It's however, the amount of money left over after the government spends money and collects taxes, right? So if we're down here, we're in a budget deficit. If we're up here, we're in a budget surplus, right? Basically, anything that shifts this curve, I'm just sort of illustrating that because I think maybe before it was a little unclear how we treated taxes, right? So to be clear, right now we're assuming that an increase in government spending, right, is going to cause an upward shift in the autonomous expenditure curve, right? We remember that? We're just assuming that like a decrease in taxes is the same thing, right? So an increase in government spending is the same as a decrease in taxes. That's basically it, right? So let's say, what do I want to do here? Okay. So this wage adjustment, right? We've talked about how it's wages that are moving this curve around, but in practice, how do wages change, right? Like think about your job that you might have, right? Like how often does your wage actually change, right? Maybe it goes up slowly over time, but like it's not really easy to change your wage, right? And in practice, like, wages, it's always gonna be easy to increase wages, like, nobody's ever gonna say no to a pay rise, but unions will negotiate against pay cuts, right? So, in practice, it's easy to increase wages, but it's difficult to decrease wages, right? Even if there were no labor unions, like, your workers won't like it, right? Like, it's gonna be difficult just socially to do, right? So, the point being that this adjustment is kind of slow relative to discretionary adjustment policy, right? So if the government could choose to not change spending or taxes to change the aggregate demand curve and just allow the supply curve to adjust, but that adjustment is slow, right? And as long as this gap is still open, it's causing the price level to increase, right? So the longer the adjustment takes, the longer the period of time during which the price level is increasing, right? And so there's one side of a coin where it's like we kind of want to let the economy do what it does and we don't want to spend taxpayer money to stabilize it. And there's another side of the coin where it's like, if this doesn't happen fast enough, then the cost might be even greater. So, like, there's a big debate about what the actual policy should be, but this is kind of like the motivation for why you might want to do it, right? So let's maybe start with this. So let's say we've got output, prices, long runs here. Perfect. So let's assume there's some kind of supply shock. Who can give me an example of something that might move the supply curve to the right, let's say? What's something, so first of all, are costs increasing or decreasing if we're moving the supply curve to the right, right? They're decreasing, right? Because we're producing more output at the same price level, exactly. So what's an example of a cost decrease that might shift the supply curve to the right?
Oil prices
Oil.
go down.
Exactly. Oil's a great one, right? That always works. So let's say there's an oil price decrease. We just, I don't know, we found a new source of oil. And so our supply curve is going to shift to the right. And it's going to what? What's happened now? We've opened an inflationary gap, right? So we could do nothing, as we've discussed, right? And that supply curve is going to slowly, wages are going to adjust and return that supply curve back to normal, right? That doesn't mean the price of oil is going to have to return to normal, right? It's other things that are going to adjust to compensate for that, right? So, but the problem is that's going to take a long time, right? Wages are going to need to decrease for the supply curve to move that way, and that's difficult to do, right? Like, I mean, I think of like customer service jobs I've worked, I think of office jobs I've worked, right? I can't remember a time where my wage actually went down, right? Like it's very difficult to decrease people's wages. Usually it has to take place like over time in the form of decreased or increased hiring, right? It's difficult to, like, some companies can lay people off, right? Some companies can't.
Wouldn't it be increased wages to get it back to the left?
Yeah, sorry, increased wages. So in this case, maybe that's a bad example. Maybe we want a leftward shift. But no, yeah, you're totally right. We need to increase wages to move it back, which in this case, I guess, is easy to do, right? But again, it's still slow because labor contracts are negotiated, like laborers meet every few years. Like labor unions will meet with employers every few years to renegotiate terms of employment, right? So it's like that change is still going to be slower than if the government just wakes up the next morning and decides to decrease or increase its spending, right? Like the government can relatively quickly do that, right? We'll talk about that in a second, but yeah. So basically what the government could do, right, and instead of letting the supply curve move back to normal, is it could decrease spending, right? And we could move this, we could shift our aggregate demand curve to the left to get us down here, right? So we've actually got a lower price level. So in this case, it's a pretty clear better outcome, right? Like either we can let it go back to the normal price level, or we can decrease government spending and bring us to an even lower price level. Obviously, like, what is government spending, right? Like, maybe if decreasing government spending means public servants get, like, I don't know, Priuses instead of like Nissan Altimas, right? Like, maybe it means that we're cutting social services, right? So like, you have to ask yourself, like, how are we going to, what is gonna happen? Like, how are we actually going to decrease spending? But just from this graph, right, like, it seems like the best thing to do is to try to shift the aggregate demand curve, right? Because we end up at a lower price level. And we're able to kind of take advantage of that decrease in oil price, right? And we can reduce the price level. So let's think about if it goes the other way, right?
But hey, Bill,
Yeah.
does that actually happen in the real world? Because I've never heard of deflation.
Well, that's the thing, right? So maybe, like, deflation is something that people we try to avoid, right? So I think in monetary policy, I'm going to touch on that more, so probably next week. But like, we'll talk. Probably I'll find an article about Japan, but like, Japan's a great example of why you want to avoid deflation, right? Because in theory, you're like, yeah, prices are going down, that's good, right? But the problem is that prices decrease rapidly, so firms produce less. And so people work less, they earn less income, they consume less is produced. It's like a vicious spiral that occurs, right? Price decreases because of increases in productivity or decreases in factor prices are beneficial, right? But it's important to avoid like long-term structural deflation. That's kind of, anyway, but we'll talk about that more next week when we talk about monetary policy. So I think that'll make a lot more sense then. Are there any other questions so far?
I kind of have the same question.
Yeah, so I mean, like, yeah, again, it's definitely a complicated question. It's a good question to ask too, right? Because you're like, why would a price decrease be bad? But yeah, we'll talk about it next week. So yeah, maybe think in your head about what some other things might look like if we decide to shift the AD curve, right? Sometimes it's not going to be so clear, right? Like, some of them are going to cause maybe a price increase, but we have to ask ourselves, is that price increase going to be worth it to keep inflation away, right? So yeah. But that's the moral of the story, right? Is the government can choose to shift the AD curve, or it can choose to let the supply curve adjust on its own, right? Yeah, so I encourage you to look at that chapter in the G-book or the textbook, because it will maybe go through some more examples. Today I want to go through an article, so I'm going to stop it here. All right. So I sent you guys the article. We're just going to go over it quickly. I sent it in the discussion, if you want to have it in front of you. So this is an article about the Bank of Canada's rate announcement last night. So this is maybe, it's going to touch on some stuff we just saw here, but also probably is going to be relevant for monetary policy next week, right? And last year, I mean, the midterm article question, I think, was like about monetary policy. So hopefully I didn't steal Gateman's article here, but we'll see. I don't know, maybe you'll use the same one. Oh, that's my booking system. You didn't see that.
Yo, Gateman called it, bro. How do you know? That's the guy from yesterday. It's Tiff Macklem, bro. Remember that.
Fucking Tiff, dude. Fucking Tiff.
What a guy. Bro, the purple tie is crazy.
She purple tie is actually nuts. I don't really see like purple ties very often.
There's a reason, bro.
All right. Nope. Okay, whatever. This is gonna have to do. So, context, last night, the Bank of Canada cut the overnight interest rate by 50 basis points, which means 0.5%, right? Which is pretty big in terms of cuts. Obviously, we'll talk about it here, but that's the context, right? This just happened like last night. This doesn't look like the start of the article. Okay. Yeah, the Bank of Canada dropped its policy rate by 50 basis points on Wednesday, bringing the interest rate down to 3.75%, as policymakers try to keep inflation near their target with the fourth consecutive rate cut. What's our target? Does anybody know? 2%, right? We'll talk more about why we target 2% and not 0% next week, but yeah, that's what we mean by our target, 2%. With a fourth consecutive rate cut. We took a bigger step today because inflation is now back to the 2% target, and we want to keep it close to the target, Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem said during prepared remarks in Ottawa. Today's interest rate decision should contribute to a pickup in demand. So why, right now, why does an interest rate decrease cause an increase in demand, right? Well, what do we mean by pickup in demand in our case? What does that mean for our curves?
It's like demand shifts to the right.
Yeah, a positive demand shock or a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the right. So when they say today's interest rate decision should contribute to a pickup in demand, how does that occur in our model? What's the story we tell ourselves behind that? Yeah.
It's because banks are more willing to loan out money when they know that if they mess up and they don't have enough money, then they could take a loan out for less interest. So they lose less money if they get caught with their shirts off. So then more people have loans, more people will spend money.
Yeah, exactly, right? More simply, we just assume in our model that that's going to shift investment, that autonomous investment depends on interest rates. So that's maybe intuitively why investment might depend on interest rates, right? But all you really need to know in our model for now is that we assume that if we lower interest rates, people are going to want to invest more, right? And that's kind of consistent with reality, but I don't know, maybe you get a question that's like, explain this quote with a diagram or something, right? And that's the story you tell. You're trying to relate it back to course content, right? Yeah.
Didn't say policy rate, is that overnight rate?
Yeah, policy rate, target for the overnight rate, I think there's some synonyms. I usually say policy rate, but I don't know, yeah. Yeah, we'll talk more about what exactly policy rate means as well next week, because there's a bunch of different rates that people talk about. We took a bigger step today. Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, we already read that. He said there was a clear consensus among governing council members that it was appropriate to cut 50 basis points at this time. So note that we say governing council members, right? Because they're not they're not politicians, right? These are people appointed by the Prime Minister, but they're not like subjects, like a conservative. If there's a conservative in power, if there's a liberal in power, they don't get to decide what the Bank of Canada's interest rate policy is, right? That's kind of just something I wanted to highlight, right? We're talking about governing council members. It's important to remember Bank of Canada conducts monetary policy separate from the government of Canada who conducts fiscal policy, right? That's sort of an important distinction. The decision to make a larger cut. Oh my God. Sorry guys, I just got a Mac recently. I don't really know how to use them now. The decision to make a larger cut comes after the consumer price index rose by 1.6% in September, right? That's inflation, right? That's synonymous. That's what we mean by inflation. The price level, which we measure by, we try to estimate with the consumer price index, right? So the CPI rose by 1.6% in September, which was below the central bank's inflation target, right? The slow growth in prices was driven mainly by a drop in energy prices. So maybe kind of relevant to the shock we talked about earlier, yes.
That 1.6%, is that not over a year though? Is that
It's,
not?
yeah, so when we say, that's a good point. So it's important to know that when we say 1.6% in September, it's 1.6% more than it was in September of last year. That's what we mean, right? It hasn't, obviously the 2% inflation target is over the course of a year, right? We expect the economy to grow by 2% over the course of the year. So when they say the inflation was 1.6% in September, they mean that the CPI rose 1.6% more than it did last September. That's what we mean. Does that make sense? That's a good point. It's called year over year. I actually wish they should probably write like year over year or something in this article. It isn't very clear, but that's what they mean. Which was below the central bank's inflation target. The slow growth in prices was driven mainly by a drop in energy prices, but policymakers now expect inflation to remain close to its target over the projected horizon. So you can see there, why would a drop in energy prices affect inflation? We've just seen it, right? How it affects the price level in our macro equilibrium, right? By shifting the short run supply curve and then the adjustment process, right? So basically what they're saying here, right, is they're saying we saw that short run supply curve move because of energy prices and we decided to intervene and move the aggregate demand curve rather than wait for it to adjust on its own, right? That's kind of what they say with that interest rate cut. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. The Bank of Canada's move was widely expected by economists who think the problem policymakers now face is a weakening economy and deflation. So interest rates generally have a lagged effect, right? Like if I decrease interest rates today, we don't really expect the economy to feel the full effect of that until about a year and a half later. So what they're saying basically is we need to start decreasing interest rates now because they had increased interest rates so quickly, like about a year and a half ago, and maybe we're just starting to feel that, right? So that's why they're so worried. obviously, when inflation was high, and we say, like, they talked earlier about how they're worried that it's below our target, they're worried about that, right? They're worried that we're just now starting to feel the effects of those rate increases, and it's gonna drive us like into a recession or deflation, right? Which is something they try to avoid at all costs. There's some vocabulary later on about, like, I think central bankers like to use the term soft landing a lot. That's what they mean by soft landing, right? Is they want us to land at 2% and then stay there rather than crash below 2% and have to come back up slowly, right? So, there you go, right there. Rate cuts will boost the economy with a lag, and that lag is about 1.5 years. Claire Fan, an economist at the Royal Bank of Canada, said in a note to clients. Even with interest rates moving lower, many borrowers can continue to expect debt payments to go up in the years ahead. That speaks to more urgency to front load the easing. That just means I think they want more rate cuts. The Bank of Canada expects gross domestic product to have grown by 1.5% in the third quarter, which is below the 2.8% it projected back in July, right? So that's maybe another sign that we're below our potential, right? The unemployment rate hit 6.4% in September, driven mainly by the labor force growing at a faster pace than hiring, disproportionately hitting youth workers. So all these things together, right? Like the Bank of Canada looks at the unemployment rate, and the unemployment rate is our biggest way to measure like where we are relative to potential, right? Like that's basically how we measure it. Like we look at trends in the unemployment rate, and we try to draw a trend line through it. And if we're above that trend, then we kind of think maybe we're in an inflationary gap. If we're below that trend, we're in a recessionary gap, right? So here, when they're saying the unemployment rate hit 6.4%, the implication is that they think the unemployment rate is going up and that we're starting to fall below our potential into a recessionary gap. So all this language should kind of be making you think recession, right? Is everybody with me so far? Are there any questions about anything we've talked about? I'm gonna maybe ask you some more explicit questions once we finish the article, but this is sort of just discussion, right? After stalling in the second half of last year, the economy grew by about 2% in the first half of this year, and we expect growth of 1.75% in the second half, Macklem said. Tiff Macklem is the governor, like the head of the Bank of Canada. The economy remains in excess supply and the labor market is soft. So like, you'll find if you continue in economics, like, I don't know why, it's maybe like a little bit elitist, maybe we like to think of make ourselves like feel smart, but there's a lot of like weird jargon we use, right? Like, there's maybe a much clearer way to communicate than the economy remains in excess supply and the labor market is soft. But like, what do we mean? What does that mean? What do we mean by the economy remains in excess supply? What does that mean in the context of our model there?
We're producing more than we're consuming.
Yeah, right. So in terms of the labor market, do we have an excess in demand for labor, or do we have a shortage of labor? Or sorry, do we have a shortage of labor or a surplus of labor?
A surplus.
Yeah, exactly, right? We're making too much. So there's there's more workers than are needed, right? Which is what they were saying earlier, right? The labor force grew faster than hiring, right? So we have more workers than there is demand for them, which should put pressure on wages to fall, right? Within our model. So when we say the economy remains in excess supply, we mean we're in a recessionary gap, right? That's basically what we mean. We're producing more than there is demand for. There's too much labor. We're making more than we're buying, things like that, right? The labor market is soft. What do we mean by that? What does a soft labor market mean? We kind of just said it, right? If you're trying to fight inflation, if think you're the central bank, right, and you want inflation to be going down right now, where do you want wages to go? If wages are going up, then there's going to be inflation. If wages are going down, then there's going to be deflation, right? So they're looking at wages and they're thinking if it's going up, then the labor market is heating up. And if it's going down, then the labor market is cooling off or softening, right? That's kind of the language they use. So when we say like soft labor market, they're basically saying there's more workers than there are demand for and wages are falling, right? So earlier, that's good. When we're above our target, that's good because they're like, yay, we're going back down towards 2%. But now that we're starting to dip below 2%, they're maybe saying, okay, like we need to maybe boost hiring. Like we need to incentivize people to hire more. We need to like do something, right? Growth is still expected. Oh, yeah. David Rosenberg, founder and president of Rosenberg Research and Associates Incorporated, said a poor Canadian economy has given the Bank of Canada the green light to stay dovish, meaning cut rates. despite the United States Federal Reserve signaling a less hasty easing path. So, we've talked about, maybe you'll see this week, how our interest rate is going to affect our exchange rate with other currencies, right? I think we've maybe talked about that a little bit, but have you seen that in class, right? Let's think about it, right? Like if our interest rate goes up in Canada and the US interest rate stays the same, then what are people gonna do, right? If you can get a higher interest rate in Canada than you can in the US, people are gonna start converting their money to Canadian dollars and investing in Canada, right? Which is going to cause the Canadian dollar to appreciate relative to the US dollar. Does that make sense? So if our interest rates in Canada go up relative to the United States, more people are gonna want Canadian dollars, and it's gonna become harder to exchange them, yeah?
Do you mean if interest rates go down, people will want to convert their money into Canadian dollars more?
Well, no, right, because if you're an investor, you want to earn a return on your money. Would you rather earn
okay.
6% or 4%, right? That's
Yeah.
our thing, right? You're right, is that there's knock-on effects, right? And then maybe the effect is less clear, but for now, we're kind of just thinking like directly what happens is more people want to convert their money to Canadian dollars, right? And we've seen how the exchange rate affects the net export curve, right? So can anybody give me some reasoning as to why we might care what the United States Federal Reserve is doing with their interest rate when we're considering what our interest rate should be?
Because we want our dollar to be comparable to the US dollar.
Do we want it to be comparable in what way?
We want it to be worth a similar value.
Do we? So right now, I think the Canadian dollar is worth maybe 70% of the US dollar, right? So if our dollar goes up in value, our exports to the United States are gonna go down, right? So I think I see a lot of discourse in Canada about like we want our dollar to be strong because I guess it sounds good to have a strong dollar. But if you're a country that relies heavily on exports, which we are, it's actually bad for your currency to appreciate, right? You want your currency to be relatively cheap, so a lot of people, it'll be cheap for people to buy your exports, right? So it's complicated, right? But that's kind of why not only are they looking at Canadian economic conditions, right? But they have to make sure, right? Like if we drop our interest rates and the United States doesn't, right? Maybe our exports are going to suffer. Yeah.
We have like what are we like? Why do we need to export so much?
Well, I mean, we don't need to, but in the short term, right, there's a lot of people whose jobs work, like their firms export things, right? So maybe their jobs are dependent on us having a certain demand for our exports, right? Maybe you're like 3M and a lot of people in the US buy Scotch tape. And like, no, it's like that, right? Like, so yeah, in the long run, maybe we shouldn't care, but in the short run, it's like people will lose their jobs if exports go up or down, right? So it's like, and if you're in the government, you kind of care what voters think, right? Like there's a lot going into it. There is a debate that we shouldn't care, and maybe we should just let exports do what they do, right? But in the short term, you're gonna have to convince people who are gonna lose their jobs to vote for you next year, right? So it's like, what do we do? Yeah.
Is there a level where the Canadian dollar falls? Like if it keeps falling, exports will keep going up technically, but like is there a level where that doesn't work anymore?
Well, you have to ask yourself, at what point is that gonna start cutting into like domestic demand, right? Like if we're exporting goods, that's less remaining for us, right? So if exports are going up and we don't want our price level to go up, then our consumption is gonna have to go down, right? So it's kind of like, that's like, it's not good or bad, right? Like if exports go up, then we might have to pay the price in terms of lower consumption. If exports go down, then there's gonna be people that lose their jobs, right? Like it's not always clear, right? Like just because something goes up or down, like if it's good or bad, right? We're just sort of talking about what might happen and what they're looking at, right? So, but that's why they even are mentioning the United States Federal Reserve, right? That's why they even care whether or not we're doing the same thing as them, right? Growth is still expected to pick up at 2.1% in 2025 and 2.3% in 2026. The Bank of Canada also expects GDP per capita to pick up next year, with a slowdown in population growth and consumption per person rising due to lower interest rates and higher household wealth. The amount of capital per worker is anticipated to pick up as investment increases next year. So what are they talking about here? When they say growth, they're talking about growth in what, right? Look at what they're talking about. They're talking about slowdown in population growth. They're talking about higher household wealth, capital per worker, right? What are they talking about? They're talking about potential GDP, right? Like that's what we mean. Like, well, here they're talking about like nominal growth. So yeah, anyway. Which one is this doing now? Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I don't remember. This is a lot longer than I thought it was. maybe highlight this here. Okay, here we go. So there are risks to the central bank's projections, including inflation. Despite the recent cooling, policymakers are concerned that lower interest rates could fuel a stronger rebound in housing, and that wage growth could continue to outpace inflation and remain higher than productivity. So why would lower interest rates cause a stronger rebound in housing? Why would that cause housing prices to go up? We decrease interest rates.
Because
Yeah.
more
More
people.
people can afford this.
Yeah, it's easier to get a mortgage, right? Like it works maybe a little counterintuitively, but you have to remember that 99% of people buy houses by borrowing money to do so, right? So if interest rates are lower, they're gonna be able to borrow more money and housing prices are naturally gonna go up, right? Just because of the nature of bidding. Currently, wage growth is around 4%, but the central bank expects it to moderate over the next year as the labor market continues to cool. A potential wider conflict in the Middle East could also impact Iran's oil production, presenting a risk of higher oil prices, right? So, what are they trying to do there, right? Yeah.
So does that mean, since the interest rate's going down, that the housing is gonna get even more expensive here?
I mean, it depends, right? Like initially, yeah, but like in the long run, who knows how people are gonna react, right? Like people tend to just kind of wanna, like housing goes up over time, kind of even if in the short run there's like fluctuations, right? So there's a lot of people kind of just buy houses without thinking, right? Like there's a lot of, like 99% of landlords in like BC are probably on interest-only mortgages, right? Like they don't even put down payments on, and they are extremely vulnerable to interest rate changes, right? So rent is very sensitive to changes in interest rates, but also like if more, like I don't know, right? Like if yeah, it's hard to say. Most people probably would say, yeah, if interest rates go down, then housing prices are gonna go up. But it's also gonna be easier to borrow money, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean it's any easier or harder for us to buy a house, right? Because if housing prices go up, at the same time, it's easier for us to borrow money, right? So you kind of have to ask yourself, like, what is the net effect, right?
Yeah, I think like usually like the stock market goes up first and then is the price for household goods.
Yeah, it's complicated, but like in general, if you're not in, yeah, I mean, don't buy, none of us are probably buying a house anytime soon, I know. Yeah, I'm certainly not, but that's, for another day. Anyway, yeah, I'll leave it here. I'll post this with the questions that I asked, sort of like in a more, organized format, so maybe we can go over them later ahead of the midterm. I'll do that later. And message me if you want to see your midterm tomorrow or Tuesday. I will also post a discussion later.